Great. And with the recording, I will do an intro. Hello, I know most of you are ready, and I'm very, very, very happy to have you join us today for Talking Data Equity. It's Friday, April 28th. And my name is Heather Krause. And I am the founder of an organization called We All Count, which is a project for equity in data. And essentially what Talking Data Equity is an opportunity for myself and you and anyone who is working on trying to get actual equity into their data projects and research projects and evidence, to get together in an informal way and compare notes, figure out what's working, share resources, and really, bottom line, feel like you are not alone, because you are not alone. And so we get together for just under an hour, and sometimes we talk about specific topics, and sometimes we have a special guest. And today is a special guest day, and it's a very exciting special guest. So let me introduce you to Michelle Cyca. And I first found Michelle's writing in a Canadian magazine called Maclean's. You should read it even if you're not Canadian. And Michelle covers all kinds of Indigenous issues for Maclean's, from a really nuanced and, for me, extremely useful and informative perspective. Michelle, I believe, is coming to us from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation today, although I should check on that. I didn't ask that in our informal chat. And I'm going to let her introduce herself, but she is without a doubt a very well-respected expert in how to think about collecting, using, and writing about Indigenous experiences, Indigenous data, Indigenous research. So we are extremely lucky that she has found time in her schedule today to be with us. And I'm not going to take up any more of that time. I am going to turn it over to Michelle. Oh, actually, Michelle, I'm so sorry. For people who are new, the logistics, the housekeeping of what this looks like is I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to share some slides, do some presentations. If you have questions or want to make comments while Michelle is sharing her slides, please do that in the Zoom chat. And afterwards, that's when, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's when you can raise your hand after Michelle is done her initial talking, because you can see this is a Zoom meeting. There are several hundred of us, and it will not work if we all just start unmuting ourselves. So sorry about that for people who are new. That is the housekeeping. Now, handing it over to Michelle. Thanks, Michelle.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you. I'm actually calling in today from the beautiful West Coast, from the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, which is known as Vancouver. But as Heather said, my Indigenous community is Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, which is Treaty 6 territory in what's called Saskatchewan. It's a beautiful morning here, so I'm very happy for all my fellow West Coast people. We've had a very long rainy winter and spring, so I feel like we really deserve this. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I feel like I keep accidentally skipping my slides forward, so I apologize in advance if I move too fast with those. But it's still 9 a.m. here, and I've only had one coffee, so be gentle with me. Here's a little introduction. Heather covered most of it, but I am a writer and an editor primarily, and I live in Vancouver, as I mentioned, where I have a handful of different jobs in journalism and media. So I am the editor of Indigenous-led conservation coverage for an online magazine called The Narwhal, which does investigative environmental journalism. I'm a contributing writer and editor to a few Canadian publications that those of you in the United States probably haven't heard of, but that's okay, I won't be offended. And I do freelance journalism for a variety of publications, mostly on this side of the border. So I write about a lot of things, but as Heather mentioned, one of my one of my sort of recurring themes is writing Indigenous stories and writing about Indigenous peoples, which is something I really came to as a result of, I think, seeing as many Indigenous people have very flat or limited narratives about our experiences in media. And I think that's really changing, which is fantastic. But in the process of reading and writing those, I've come to, I guess, have a bit of a body of knowledge or some thoughts on storytelling approaches to working with Indigenous communities that hopefully you'll find some value in today. And I also want to mention that I have a cat, and he will probably be popping his little gray head in and out of my camera as we go. Oh, and one other thing I'll mention is that I do have a background in health research. I did a master's of public health over a decade ago at the University of British Columbia, and I did work in health research for a few years. So I have some familiarity with data and analyzing data, research data, but I will emphasize that I'm not a data expert as per the slide. That's your area of expertise. What I really want to talk about today is approaches and orientations to the work of collaborating or working with Indigenous people. And hopefully that provides kind of a versatile foundation for whatever it is you do in your day-to-day life and your roles. But as Heather mentioned, please feel free to add questions into the chat, and I'll try and keep an eye on it as we go. So as mentioned today, it's a little bit of an orientation to where to begin your work if you're working with Indigenous communities or Indigenous people, whether that's in the context of writing, journalism, research, or any kind of new collaboration. I know from talking to people that there's often a lot of anxiety about how to approach this work. I think there is an understanding that it's possible, even with good intentions, to do harm. And so I think that just thinking about how to begin is kind of the biggest piece of that work often before you even begin, initiating a project or a collaboration. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that today. And then we will get into a few style notes and tips because I'm a writer and an editor, and I think some of those are useful. I know that in the US, there is both a different history with Indigenous peoples, and there is often different language and terminology. So if anything I mention is unclear or the context is unfamiliar, please feel free to ask questions and I'll do my best to clarify. Also, thank you to the person in the chat who is appreciating this vintage Mac in the background. Always hard to cultivate a Zoom background, but I think that's pretty cute too. So 2 caveats that I like to start with. One is how I understand my own identity and situate it. So I am Cree Nehea Eskeo, which is a Cree woman. And I'm also a member of an urban Indigenous community, which I think is something that often gets kind of missed in discussions of talking about Indigenous people because there's very limited data on Indigenous people outside of reservations or Indigenous communities in Canada. For instance, urban Indigenous people tend to be undercounted, and they tend to be really diverse communities and quite different from what you would find on a First Nation or on a reservation. So I mentioned that because I really resist. So I love being introduced as an expert. The label of expert, I don't think it's possible to be an expert in Indigenous topics broadly. I think I can bring a lived perspective that's quite specific to my experience. And I think a lot of that does overlap with other Indigenous people's experience, but I really resist the idea that one person's experience can translate into the myriad contexts that Indigenous identities and Indigenous experiences fall within. In Canada, there's, I think, 630 First Nations, there's Métis Nations, there are the Inuit, and all of those are really different experiences, different histories, different contexts, different laws. And so I just like to say that because I often see work that entails bringing in one Indigenous person as kind of like a token expert. And I'm just going to say off the bat that that's not the role I'm here to play today. But hopefully you'll find something useful in my presentation anyway. So as I mentioned, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about approach. And And I just want to start with a quote that I really love from Billy Ray Belcourt, who is an author. He's a poet and a novelist and an essayist from Treaty 8 from the Drift Pile First Nation. And this is from an essay that he published called Fatal Naming Rituals. So in narratives that hinge on proving our humanness, Indigenous people sit stilled in the role of the described. And as the described, our words are pit against us. And I come back to this quote a lot because I think it gets at the ways that even with good intentions, Indigenous people can be written about or included in ways that are harmful and limiting, that often have to do with how the person who's engaging with their work or engaging with their experience is coming to that relationship. So, I mean, Billy Ray Belcourt wrote this essay in response to how his poetry was described by non-Indigenous reviewers, but also just more broadly about how Indigenous people have always been an object of study and an object of fascination. And even as the spectrum of that treatment has moved from dehumanizing to more empathetic and sympathetic, it often still relies on stereotypes. It draws from a body of colonial, a colonial history, a colonial understanding. And it still often is really reductive and limiting. And I think genuinely the only way to move through that is through a depth of engagement and experience that not only positions Indigenous people as equals in the work that involves them and experts, but also brings a level of understanding and depth that you only get from true engagement and relationships. So that brings us to my first point, which is that I really encourage anyone who is working with an Indigenous community to consider that the foundation of that work has to be a relationship that precedes and extends beyond whatever endeavor you're working on. Also, I should mention I'm 8 months pregnant and I run out of breath like halfway through everything I say. So if it seems like I'm breathing heavily, it's not just that I'm thrilled to be here and very excited. It's also that there's a person pressing on my lungs. In journalism, and I think in research, there's still this legacy of assuming that your work is objective somehow, like that you're an outsider to it, that you're a conduit for knowledge, that you're producing something in which you're sort of impartial and detached. And I think this is really an orientation that goes against how work happens in Indigenous communities. And I think it's just fundamentally a really flawed premise. So there is no such thing, I think, as objectivity when you're working with a community. And storytelling, whether it's journalism or research, anything where you're producing a body of knowledge, it's not a neutral act. You're an active agent in it. You're shaping it through your own understanding, through the questions you ask, through the approach you take. And so I think you do need to think of yourself as always in relation to the people that you're working with. And when you're working from the outside of a community, you're reproducing a relationship that's fundamentally extractive. If you're going in and trying to extract knowledge, even if you believe you're doing it for the benefit of a community through representing their experience or telling an important story, your orientation to that work is still primarily about removing something as opposed to embedding yourself in it. And I also encourage people to think about it as a relationship, because you should be accountable always, always to the people that you're working with or writing about. And that means that you need to be accountable for any emotions you bring up in the work that you do, any impacts you have. You have to be accountable to them, and that they can let you know how your work is impacting them or how your conduct is impacting them. And so that does require a foundation of trust. And if you don't have that, if you were to be, say, writing about a community or a person that you don't know at all and that you haven't taken some time to get to know, then there is always the potential for misunderstanding and for harm. So often what that looks like in my work is doing a lot of relationship building or discussion before a project even starts, whether that's a story that I'm writing or a community that I'm working with. And I often ask myself whether I'm even the person to write a particular story. This is a set of questions that I think are really valuable when you're working with Indigenous people or any community, honestly. And it's something I really try and focus on, which is always beginning from thinking, what is my purpose here in this narrative? How am I active in this story? How is my presence helping or harming this community? What am I trying to achieve? And is that aligned with the people that I'm working with? So I think you always need to be aware of the potential to do harm. This is especially true in journalism. Actually, I think it's probably true in every field, but it's really possible to harm people even if your intentions are good. Both through the process of work that raises difficult emotions and in the fact that you're putting something out into the public and you can't control how it will be perceived or responded to, or what that level of visibility, can do for people. Can be really helpful, but it can also be harmful. So I think considering your intentions and considering the community first and what your obligations are to that community is a really important place to begin the work, and just asking if you should be the person leading it or involved in it, or if there are ways to amplify other storytellers, other people who are already doing this. But as always, I think people are responsible for their own conduct, their impact, and their education. So hopefully you are, bringing the knowledge that you have. You're thinking actively about this conduct before you enter a community or an Indigenous space. And you're always aware of, the impact you leave behind, even when a story or a project is finished. So this is something that I think about a lot in Canadian media. I imagine it translates south of the border as well. And I feel like there's a real emphasis on like Indigenous stories. And then often in stories that aren't explicitly about Indigenous people, there are just no Indigenous people or perspectives mentioned. I think this is a very interesting false dichotomy. It's surprising to me that it is so recurrent. I live in a city, Vancouver, BC, where, 5 to 10% of the population is Indigenous. In other Canadian cities, it's even higher. And yet Indigenous people often only appear in narratives if the story is explicitly about their experience. And this creates kind of a perception that there are like Indigenous communities and, Canadian or American communities, that they're quite separate. As I mentioned, it ignores the experience of urban Indigenous people. And it reinforces this idea that Indigenous people are other somehow, that their experiences need to be handled totally differently, or that they have sort of no general relationship to the rest of someone's experience or community life. So if Indigenous people don't show up anywhere in your work or your writing, except when you're doing an explicitly Indigenous focused project, it's a good opportunity to ask yourself why that is. What relationships are missing, who you fail to include, whether you've failed to ask questions that capture people's identity or give them the opportunity to name that identity, or if you're just creating or engaging in spaces that are generally hostile or exclusionary to Indigenous people. But it is a real recurring problem, I think. And I'll talk a little bit later about when Indigenous people do tend to show up in stories, but I urge people not to think that they have to go out and like tell an Indigenous story to have an Indigenous perspective. Indigenous perspectives are on every issue, whether that's environmentalism, economic development, education, healthcare. They're there and they have a relevant perspective to include. And while it can be helpful to zero in on the the lived experience of people who have a particular and often marginalized perspective, I think that sort of relentlessly separating those out can also do a disservice to the complexity of our communities and the way Indigenous experiences are embedded in the fabric of our broader communities as well. Another thing I think about a lot in journalism that I think applies probably in every field is the need to reach outward into communities in a broader way. So Indigenous nations, First Nations, and Indigenous communities, I find are still often depicted as quite monolithic. This can include the ways in which, say, the words of a single person are taken to represent the views of an entire community. In places like Vancouver, where I live, where there are 3 different host nations, as well as a very diverse urban Indigenous population, there's often like a representation of what the Indigenous view on an issue is. Again, this is really limiting, and it's often the result of going to the same well over and over. If you read a lot of Indigenous stories anywhere, but in the community where you live or work, you'll often see the same people quoted again and again and again. This is partly convenience on the part of the person who's doing the work, returning to an expert who is willing to chat or is, is positioned as an expert, is comfortable speaking to media or to researchers. But it means that you're ending up both limiting the perspectives that you're including, and often you're putting a big burden on the person who's doing that work. And to me, it's often a sign of really shallow engagement with the community if there's no relationships that go beyond that one familiar spokesperson. It is important when working with Indigenous communities, particularly nations, to follow protocols. So it's often appropriate and necessary to go through formal leadership when making requests. But if you're spending time in community and getting to know people, and you have the opportunity to talk to, elders and youth, members of different communities, parents, children, you're going to have a richer understanding of that community. You're going to have richer perspectives, and you don't run the same risk of reproducing a really limited narrative about that community's views and who they are. And again, another thing I think is really important to consider is whose voices you're including in your story. So something I often look for in Vancouver, and you can play this game anywhere, is if there's a story about an Indigenous story, so to speak, who's being quoted in it. So it's very common in Vancouver for there to be quotes from urban Indigenous people, but no one from any of the three host nations here, the Musqueam, Squamish, or the Tsleil-Waututh. Similarly, sometimes stories about Vancouver will not include any urban Indigenous perspectives, even when they're explicitly speaking about issues that affect the urban Indigenous community, like poverty in the inner city. And this is, again, that fallacy of assuming there's one Indigenous person who can speak to a general experience without thinking, what is the experience we're trying to capture and to represent. So when you're working in urban spaces where there's a diverse community, or anywhere where there's overlapping territories, like here where there's three host nations, but in most parts of Canada and the US, you're talking about territories that are shared by multiple nations. In Canada, the Métis Nation has homelands that stretch across several First Nations. And so you should be thinking about all of those communities as participants and perspectives that you would like to consider and include. And again, resist the idea always that there's one Indigenous person who can represent like exactly the perspective that you're looking for. It's convenient, but it's not a great way to do work or research. Chloe, that's a really good question. So I think inclusion, belonging, relationality, what those would look like in a research project about health with no particular focus on Indigenous populations. I think if you're breaking out Indigenous identity in any kind of project, and this is true in health research or elsewhere, if you're breaking out ethnic identity, it's important to remember, I think, that being Indigenous is not necessarily an ethnic identity. It's a nationality for most people. So it can include a really wide range of experiences, I think. I'm not trying to be vague, I'm trying to get to this point. So, for instance, if you're looking at, say, how racism impacts the care that Indigenous people perceive, it might be relevant, whether someone is racialized and visibly Indigenous, or whether there's someone like me who is not read as Indigenous in most spaces. And that's a quality that you can't get to just by asking somebody if they identify as Indigenous when you're collecting data. And so I think it would have to begin ideally by the process of like how you're asking people about their identity, how they identify, and I guess what you're trying to get at in your research beyond just asking people if they're Indigenous. I would also say it's valuable to ask people in research what community they're from and where they live, which will sort of help to get at that distinction between whether they're a member of an urban Indigenous population or if they're a member of a local nation, just to ensure whether your data is representative of the populations that you're working with. So I hope that's helpful in that regard. Something I think about a lot as well is how past research shows up in the work that we do, even from how we formulate the questions that we're working on or the stories that we're investigating. All knowledge builds on pre-existing knowledge, but if you're drawing on resources or stories or bodies of work that are colonial, you're going to inadvertently reproduce the assumptions and the biases that are built into that data. So this can take all kinds of forms. One that I see often in Canada is our history of residential schools, which were Indian boarding schools in the United States. And the numbers used for those in Canada, we often say at the height of the residential school system, there were 80 schools operating, and there were more than 130 in the history of the residential school system. This is a really common fact that gets repeated a lot, that leaves out the fact that there were schools that weren't run by the federal government, that were provincially funded, that predated the federal system and were run by religious organizations. And that even during the federal system, there were schools that were run entirely by the church without federal funding. So even like reproducing that figure leaves out a lot of survivors of that system and a lot of experiences. And it's not that it's incorrect, but it's a partial understanding of a bigger topic. And so again, like, these facts are not necessarily, it's not that there was harmful intent or colonial intent sometimes in how data was collected, but it's often partial at best. So it's just good to be, I think, critical of even your starting point when you're beginning to formulate a question or a research topic, to consider, who are you treating as an expert or authority in this topic? How's your work maybe reproducing colonial assumptions in the data you're working with, and how are you challenging those assumptions? So again, another framing that I often see in the discussion of the education system is that when it's discussed, how many Indigenous children went to residential school, those numbers are often contrasted with the number of children that they say received no education, who didn't go to residential school or a day school. And I always think that's a really interesting way to frame that, because it presumes that there was no education happening in communities at all before the implementation of a colonial school system. And it's just a really simple statement that I just see everywhere, the number of children who received no education versus those who went to residential school, that just presumes there was one kind of school that counted. There was no other education anywhere. There were no educational systems or structures or ways of transmitting knowledge. And that's just the kind of assumption that gets repeated and re-embedded in writing on this subject, in the ways people think about, the history of education or learning in Indigenous communities and how it may have been disrupted. It's a really small example, but I just think that, any place you begin, you're drawing on previous knowledge, and it's important to be really, really critical of where that knowledge comes from. And yeah, Bruno, thanks for that point in the chat. I think there is a lot of colonialism hanging over in our current systems, and it's so embedded that it's often invisible. In BC, in British Columbia, where I live, there was a big report a few years ago about racism experienced by Indigenous people in healthcare, that demonstrated how pervasive it is. And I've also been working on a story about birthing services in Indigenous communities, which have generally required Indigenous people through a federal policy to be evacuated from rural and remote communities to southern hospitals to give birth. And this research, like the body of research around it and the body of knowledge around it, often really just takes as a granted assumption that the best thing is for people to access the service in the South, and that the problem is that many Indigenous people just don't go, that people try and stay in their communities to give birth because they don't want to spend months away from their home and from their families. And it's only recently that research has begun to explore, what services can people access at home, what traditional systems of midwifery, what health services, what other factors make it possible for people to give birth safely in their own communities. But I think it's really interesting that you still often see this assumption that there's like a good way to sort of force people into a colonial system rather than assuming maybe the system itself is the problem or a problem. And even beginning from that as your research question, like in this case, reading back through documents that say, how do we encourage Indigenous birthing people to comply with this federal policy, as opposed to thinking, what are alternatives to it that could be safe, that are community-led. That's quite a recent shift. And there is, for those who are interested, really fascinating data from Northern Quebec communities about safe birth in these really remote Inuit communities in Quebec, which was actually the subject of a New York Times piece that I would be happy to share after this. So another thing I see a lot in my work and in my general experience existing as an Indigenous person is the idea that inclusion and engagement are sort of worthwhile aims in and of themselves. I'm not sure how research funding works in the US, but in Canada, there's a real emphasis on projects that involve Indigenous perspectives or Indigenous knowledge that really encourage people to have like at least one Indigenous person involved in a project, or to consult with Indigenous communities, which often takes the form of going to them when something has already been done and saying, how do you feel about this? Do you like it? It's a real checkbox approach. And I often hear people say that that's better than nothing. I really am skeptical of that. I don't know that it's better than nothing. To me, it feels effectively like nothing. If you're just bringing something to people really late in the game, and just so that you can say, we took this to the Indigenous community and they said it was great, that's not meaningful engagement. I'm sure you all know this, but it's really startling to me how common it is still as a practice. If you're just including Indigenous people because someone said you had to include them to get funding, or because someone was like, hey, we should have one Indigenous voice on this, can you just go ask someone a question? That's not meaningful engagement. It's not adding anything of value to your work. And it risks, as mentioned, presenting a perspective that's not really what you're looking for, that flattens the narrative, that generalizes too broadly, and that ultimately ends up just kind of reproducing really limited understandings of who Indigenous people are. So I'm quite skeptical of it. I think if you're including Indigenous people, it should be active participation. They need to be involved at every step, not just at the end. They need to be partners. So their consultation needs to mean something. It can't just be, that you showed it to them and they said, yes, we've seen it, check a box. What power do they have in that dynamic? And if you're including Indigenous people in your work, again, this goes back to thinking of that as a relationship that has reciprocity built into it. You should be thinking, what value is it adding for them? The value for the person doing the work is often clear. What's not clear is what the people you're relying on for expertise, for input, for their thoughts, for their lived experience, what are they getting out of it? If you can't answer that question, if you're not giving real value back through your work, then it's a good point to stop and reconsider. And similarly, this relates to the last slide, but consider the demand that you're placing on Indigenous people when you're doing this work. It's not to say that, again, you shouldn't include Indigenous people because you don't want to create a burden on them. But there are very few Indigenous people in most professional spaces. So I worked in the university sector. There's very few Indigenous people, in faculty positions and research positions. They're underrepresented in many spaces. And this often means that if there's pressure within an institution or within, say, a research program to include Indigenous perspectives, you're relying on the same people over and over again to provide that expertise, to be that voice, to be a sounding board, to be a resource. It creates a really unsustainable burden. And I think it's really challenging because, I don't know that there's necessarily a better way at this point, given that there is this underrepresentation. But I do think it's important to be really aware of how you're using people's time, what you're asking of them, why you're asking it of them. Again, like checkbox inclusion is not necessarily meaningful or valuable in and of itself. And so if you're going to somebody for support on a project or involvement, it needs to be valuable, it needs to be meaningful, and they need to be the right person for it. You know, if there's like one Indigenous person at your university who you're thinking of asking to be involved on a project, or if you know one person in the community who could be a source for a story, if they're not the right source, it's not going to help. It's going to limit your work. It's a demonstration of your own. This is me talking to myself, so I'm not criticizing you, but it's a kind of laziness. It's intellectual laziness and it's professional laziness. And that shallowness of approach will come through in your work. So I think that, you know, it's important to recognize that Indigenous people and that other members of marginalized communities are often asked to do a lot of this consultation on top of their other professional responsibilities. And you really need to be cognizant of that, I think, when you go to them for a self-serving purpose. And in many ways, you know, journalism can be self-serving. I'm often asking people to talk about, you know, areas of expertise or experience with me that they've talked about many times before. And I try and be aware of the fact that what I see as a value for my work is not the same value for them. And, you know, going back to timing, I don't like to generalize too broadly about Indigenous people, but you have to be expansive and flexible in your scheduling, especially if you're working with elders or with anybody who has community responsibilities. Because especially once you have them in conversation, we tend to be a talkative group of people. You know, if you're trying to hammer out a 15-minute consultation or like get people to answer one question for the sake of a project you're working on, you're not only not going to do a great job of using their time, but you're not going to get a great answer. You want to make sure you're giving people time to share, to bring their own experience and positionality, to share the narratives that they think are important. You know, I often just see consultations that are really, really strict and formulaic, and it's not really how people are relating to a subject, how Indigenous people relate to that subject, how they understand it, the perspective that they want to bring. There's a real mismatch there in orientation. So I think, again, as you're considering the demands you're placing on people, you need to be willing to adjust your schedule and make time for people to share what they want to share it safely, to share expansively. And then it's really your job to do the work of meeting them in the middle to understand that narrative. And Dennis, thank you for saying compensation. I really think that this is a missed piece. And I will mention it a bit later too, but you know, there are also protocols around gifts and thanking people for their time that are really necessary. You should be observing those if you're working in a community where it's customary to give a gift or a monetary acknowledgement of somebody's expertise. Food is very big as well. But yeah, if you're asking people for professional knowledge for a professional purpose, if they're contributing to your work with their expertise or their experience, they should be compensated for that. Absolutely. And that is often an overlooked piece. And this one, I think a lot of this speaks for itself, but I do just want to visit it. I think it's important to consider the power dynamic that you often bring as a professional to a situation and how you can mitigate that. So, you know, when I work with Indigenous people for a piece of journalism or for a reporting project, I really try and assume, I don't try and make any assumptions, I guess, about what they're familiar with or what they understand of the terms or processes that I might use. So I always begin with informal conversations, you know, before any interviews, before any quotes, to tell them about my intention, to tell them what the process will entail. So if we do an interview, how I could use it, what their rights to answer questions or not answer questions are, what I'll do to ensure their safety in the reporting process, who else I'm talking to. It's often going above and beyond what you would consider like a standard of practice in journalism. You know, but I often tell people that I'll share interview transcripts, that I'll come back to them before the piece is published and give them a sense of what I'm including so that they can let me know if they're comfortable with it. I think it's really important to take that extra care, often above and beyond what's a professional norm in your field. Because again, you're often benefiting from the work in the way that somebody who's involved in it as a participant is not. And they're often much more vulnerable to the impacts of that work than you are. So I think that it's important to be proactive, to ensure that people are comfortable, to ensure that they understand what their rights are to consent or to withdraw that consent, and to do as much as possible to make them partners in it. So again, I think sharing transcripts, notes, audio and video recordings should all be basic practice, or at least offering to share those. And just ensuring that communication continues beyond the scope of a project. So staying in touch, making sure that you don't disappear on people, that you're continuing that relationship is really important. And this comes up a lot. It's kind of a buzzword now, trauma-informed interviewing or trauma-informed care. I think that there's still quite a bit of ambiguity about what it means. But the approach that I bring is understanding that a lot of the work that we do in journalism and in research, you're often visiting topics that are really challenging for people or that draw on challenging personal experiences. And you want to be cognizant of that in your approach, in the questions you ask, and in the care you take. So some ways to do that are often rethinking professional norms about how to do that work. So for instance, when interviewing, the one-to-one interview is a pretty professional standard in many fields, but it can be unsafe for people who would like to have a support person there. So considering how you're offering people supports, how you're making supports available in your process is important. Again, being expansive with time. So going at the pace of the person you're speaking to and being really attuned to body language and nonverbal signals if you're asking them difficult questions. Offering food and drinks, meeting them in spaces that are more comfortable, being willing to sort of go at their pace, pause questioning, take lots of time, and be willing to stop if you need to stop for their safety. And also, again, this goes back to the idea that you're not an objective outsider and you're not a neutral observer, you're a person. I find this is a real reluctance in a lot of fields like journalism, where people are sort of taught not to involve themselves too much in a story, but you want to introduce yourself, be personal, share where you're coming from, who you are, who your family is. Those are valuable details. They create a sense of safety. They help to establish that relationship, and making sure you're building in the time to do that in any process, that process of introductions, of getting to know you. That is part of trauma-informed care. You're meeting somebody as a person. You're not just there to extract information from them. And as much as possible, try and prepare people. So let them know in advance what you want to talk about, share specific questions. Again, give them the option not to answer. You have to, I think, always tell people that they have that option. In the moment, many people feel pressured to answer a question, even if they're not comfortable. Take lots of time. And even when you're talking about something difficult, don't reduce people to a trauma or a difficult experience. Give them space to talk about joy, about happiness, to share complexity, to share other stories. People are more than the sum of difficult things or experiences that have happened to them, and you want to make sure you're engaging with a whole person, and not reducing people to the trauma of an experience. I just have a couple more. I realize I've talked for longer than I meant to, Heather. I hope that's okay. But as mentioned,
totally great.
Okay. As mentioned, I will give a few concrete tips. I realize this has been very high level. I hope some of it has been helpful. But I'll get into a few specifics based on some things I've seen that I think can be helpful. So one thing when you're writing, whatever you're writing, make sure you know what you're talking about. It's amazing how often I see, for instance, on the West Coast, people talk about Turtle Island. I don't know if Turtle Island is a concept that is pervasive everywhere. It's an Anishinaabe understanding of the land that doesn't really have significance, for instance, on the West Coast with West Coast peoples, and yet it's really become like a sort of catch-all term that people think of as like an indigenous alternative to saying North America or Canada or the United States, and it drives me nuts. There's a way in which I think people often substitute a term with like what they see as an Indigenous alternative without really thinking about how it's grounded in a specific cultural context or what it means even. And again, if you're using a term just because it sounds good and you've seen it used elsewhere, you might be reproducing an assumption that's not entirely accurate or not entirely what you're going for. There's nothing wrong with saying Turtle Island. It's just weird how often people say it here on the West Coast. And don't default to generalized language. So I've said Indigenous a million times in the last 45 minutes, but when you're talking about specific people, there's rarely a need to call them Indigenous. You can call them, you know, they have a nationality, they have a way that they identify. I identify as Cree, I identify as a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, member of the urban Indigenous community here in Vancouver. Those are better ways to describe someone than just saying Indigenous over and over. If you're talking about First Nations in Canada, you should say First Nations. If you're talking about Métis people, you should say Métis. There's a degree to which generalized language just is used because people are sort of uncertain who they're talking about or what they're talking about. And I think it's both limiting and it often, again, terms are not interchangeable. First Nations is not the same thing as Métis or Inuit. And if you're not sure, it's generally a sign that you should do a little bit more investigating. Yes, I think I have Two-Spirit on the next slide. Oh, also resist the urge to make assumptions or reframe language. I say this because a lot of elder Indigenous people still use terms like Native or Indian. My grandma called herself an Indian until the end of her life. That can make people really uncomfortable, but I really encourage you to resist reframing how people describe themselves or what they call themselves. It's important to give space to that complexity and to recognize that people's identities are their own. You know, you don't actually have the right to tell them how they identify. And you shouldn't make assumptions. So I have a slide about being willing to ask questions, but you know, this is a pretty standard question everywhere. You ask people, where are you from? And how would you like to be identified in this story? So again, who are you speaking about? You want to define communities and nations. As I mentioned before, Indigenous people are nations, not ethnicities. Cree is a nationality. It encompasses many different kinds of appearances. It's limiting to think of Indigenous people as a race. That leads us to the 23andMe fallacy, where people do a DNA test, they get 1% Native on it, and then they start thinking they're Indigenous. It's about relation to a community, to a land, and to a place. Always avoid colonial possessives. I feel like I see this a lot. I see this tip a lot, and I see this framing a lot. So it's worth reemphasizing. You never want to say Canada's Indigenous people. You never want to say America's Native people. Just avoid that possessive. They're sovereign peoples. And thank you to the person who mentioned the chat further up about Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit is a specific identity that kind of relates to queerness, gender, and sexuality, but is not interchangeable with queer. I often see queer Indigenous people described as Two-Spirit inaccurately. I see Two-Spirit appropriated in non-Indigenous contexts. That's a term with a very specific cultural meaning. And if someone identifies as Two-Spirit, by all means, you should call them Two-Spirit. Don't assume that every queer Indigenous person is Two-Spirit. Don't. Again, challenge colonial framing. I also hate the term traditional territory, which presumes that there's a past territory that is no longer someone's homeland. I do use homelands instead typically, or just territory or lands. Be vigilant about past tense and passive framing. You know, when you say like Coast Salish people lived in Vancouver, that's assuming that they're no longer here. It's amazing how often this slips in. Passive framing too is saying, you know, like Canada granted treaty rights to Indigenous people, which aligns both the negotiation process, the active process of treaties, and, you know, again, positions Indigenous people as sort of these like past tense entities. So just, again, it's something you can just be vigilant for. There's grammar tools online where it'll tell you if you're doing passive framing, and it's amazing how often you run a story about Indigenous people through them and everything about the Indigenous people is in passive tense. Recognize and affirm Indigenous sovereignty rights and laws. So Indigenous nations are sovereign nations. Treaties are about nation-to-nation relationships. Canada and the US signed treaties with Indigenous people, which recognize that they are sovereign nations unto themselves with their own laws, their own governance. So don't position those as somehow like ceremonial or sort of less substantial, say, than Canadian or American law. This also happens a lot. Challenging colonial framing. This goes back to the aversion against generalizing, but Indian, Aboriginal, Native are often used in specific contexts. For instance, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms has a section on Aboriginal rights. My status card still says Indian on it in 2 places. Often a real reluctance to look at how this colonial language is embedded in our institutions, but sometimes you just have to acknowledge that colonial institutions still have colonial language. I have just a few more slides and I promise we can do some questions. Avoid traumatic stereotypes. Duncan McHugh is a great journalist. He has a great book here on writing about Indigenous people that I encourage everybody to pick up. But he famously said Indigenous people tend to only appear when they're drunk, drumming, dancing, or dead in stories. If those are the only things you're covering, you're doing something wrong. Please write about things other than trauma or traumatic experiences. There's such a demand for Indigenous storytelling around June 21st, which is National Indigenous Day here, around September 30th, which is a day of recognition for truth and reconciliation, particularly around residential schools. Every time there's a traumatic incident, it's really dispiriting as an Indigenous person to only see ourselves in media when something terrible is happening. So I encourage people to look for opportunities to explore Indigenous joy and resilience instead. And whenever possible, use Indigenous languages and learn and apply style conventions for each individual language. Cree, for instance, has no capital letters. I often see Cree words capitalized and they shouldn't be. I'm not sure about other languages, but that's just a small example. If you're using an Indigenous word, please make sure you use it correctly. You don't need to italicize or put things in quotations when you do. And lastly, don't be afraid to ask questions. Hopefully this has been helpful, but I think a lot of people are still afraid of asking and getting something wrong and offending somebody. And as a result, they're like terrified to engage. But that's really prioritizing your own discomfort over the integrity of the work that you're doing. I think if you do the work to build relationships, you'll generally be more comfortable asking questions of people. And I also think Indigenous people are very nice. Most of them have been asked the questions you would want to ask before. They're not going to be offended or angry. I saw a question earlier about, Alaska Native or American Native. If you're working with a community or a person, just ask them how they want to identify. You don't have to be afraid. I urge you just to do the work of asking questions. It gets less scary every time you go. The end. I have a couple of resources. These will be available to you, I assume, after the presentation and the slides, but just a few things that I found really helpful. Most of them are journalism specific, but I think they have utility beyond this field. And I'm sorry that I talked so long. As I mentioned, Indigenous people are very chatty, but I look forward to getting into some of your questions. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Michelle. No one here is feeling like you talk too long. I promise you. You have an entire room of people in paying very close attention, and you were so you were already taking the Q&A live while we were going through. So
love the Q&A live.
Yeah, so so no problem at all. This has been extremely helpful. I think we do have time. If one person who's here wants to raise their hand and ask a question, we can take that before we have to wrap up and send you on your way. Is there anybody who wants to in the room who wants to raise their hand? And you can see how happy everyone is. Okay, go ahead, Chloe. Hi, Chloe.
Hi, thank you very much for this amazing presentation. I was just like talking about how important it is to incorporate all these things into the work, every kind of work that we do. I used to work with the Indigenous Advanced Education and Skills Council, and the research we did with Indigenous Institute representatives, we had some we encountered like a bit of a hindrance or challenges in transcribing different kinds of indigenous languages into transcript. So I wonder if you have any advice on that, because like we work with really diverse groups. It could be like Cree, could be First Nations, and we weren't like sure how to go about that. And the expertise in transcription services don't always aren't able to capture these things. So if you had any advice on that.
Yeah, that is tricky. I mean, I would go back. I often encounter this as well when people use like a term in an interview or something, and then I transcribe it and we'll have to go back to them later to ask about spelling and pronunciation. And it's tricky because for many indigenous languages, because they have been, transcribed into written form relatively recently, there's often non-standard spellings, or Cree, for instance, has like 5 main dialects with different spelling conventions in each. And so I guess I would just try and build the time in to go back to people and ask for clarification on how a term is being written, and how it's being used too, if the meaning has been translated accurately. I recognize that can be pretty challenging. So then if you don't have the time to do that, I would just ensure there's a contextual note explaining like your understanding of the term and how it's meant to be used, and be willing to maybe correct it later. But definitely tricky if you're using a transcription service or software. In that case, I would almost always make sure you're doing the work in the interview or in the process to ask people for clarification on how a term should be written and what it means, so that you can check it later. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful. It is really tricky.
Yeah, that is going to be a tricky situation. And I really want to thank you for taking a complicated question in the last few minutes of your time with us. So we need to wrap it up, which I know is heartbreaking. This has been a very, very wonderful hour. Michelle, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule, and congratulations on the baby. So thank you for taking time.
I don't usually get so out of breath. But thanks, everybody.
Well,
so wonderful. And I also have my contact information on a slide, my email, and my website. And I really encourage people to feel free to email me or get in touch if there's something you want to ask or just want to connect.
Well, that's very generous of you. This is a community of people who will do that. And so when you do that, make sure you follow all of the things in this slide here. So, all right. So a programming note, there is no Talking Data Equity next week. We're back in 2 weeks. So we will see you then. I think it's either May 11th or 12th. I don't have it in front of me, but 2 weeks from today is when we're back. And I hope you all have a fabulous rest of your day, and a very sincere and heartfelt thanks to Michelle. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.